Welcome back to the deep dive. We've just received a fascinating stack of notes from Self-Sensei, and today we're plunging into a question that's fundamental to, well, everything you try to do better? How do you actually get skilled at something?
Yeah, that's the core question, isn't it?
Whether it's a job skill, a hobby, or just navigating life a bit more effectively.
That's right. These notes, titled Factors Influencing Skill Development, give us a really deep look at all the moving parts. Many of them kind of hidden in plain sight that shape your journey from novice to capable or maybe even expert.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission today is to pull out the most important nuggets of insight from this material. We want to understand the interconnected web of factors Self-Sensei lays out.
Mm.
Everything from the nitty-gritty of how you practice to the kind of feedback that actually helps,
Mm.
what truly fuels your drive,
Right, your motivation.
the unique strengths and quirks you bring as an individual learner, and even the environment you're learning in.
Because, as the notes really emphasize, becoming skilled isn't just a straight line forward. It's complex, often messy, and deeply personal.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about what you learn, but how you become capable of doing it efficiently and effectively.
Exactly. The source material defines skill development as basically enhancing specific abilities. And it goes way beyond just professional upskilling or, picking up new tech skills for work.
So it's not just about the resume then.
Not at all. It includes pursuing personal interests, mastering an instrument, getting better at public speaking,
Yeah.
even improving your emotional intelligence,
Oh, okay.
cultivating both those traditional hard skills and the crucial soft skills for more, let's say, holistic growth.
And the significance of that.
Well, think well-roundedness, career adaptability, maybe a more engaged personal life. It touches a lot of areas.
And underpinning this capacity to get better
Yeah.
is something actually happening inside our brains, right? You mentioned neuroplasticity.
Precisely. The notes confirm that at a really fundamental level, skill development involves physical changes in the brain. Practice actually rewires the neural pathways, making actions and thoughts more efficient over time. Your brain adapts.
Fascinating to think about. So it's complex, it's nonlinear, and it's fundamentally about changing your brain through doing things.
Right.
The notes also talk about how this journey often looks like progressing through stages, even though, as you said, it's deeply personal.
They do. Yeah, while acknowledging everyone's path is unique, there are these typical phases, usually start in the cognitive stage.
Okay, cognitive.
Yeah.
This is where you're consciously thinking about every single step,
Yeah.
right? Like learning to drive a stick shift for the first time, that kind of feeling.
That's a perfect analogy. You're forming a mental blueprint, really focusing on understanding the fundamental concepts and relying heavily on external cues or instructions. It feels effortful.
Yeah, definitely. Then you move into the associative stage. What happens there?
This is where you start smoothing things out. Through consistent practice, you're refining the movements, minimizing errors.
Fewer stalls in the stick shift analogy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you start connecting the action with the outcome more fluidly. Still need feedback, probably, but you're integrating it more effectively. You're starting to feel it.
And eventually, the autonomous stage. This is the kind of just doing it phase.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah.
The skill becomes largely automatic. You can perform it with minimal conscious thought, often while, thinking about something else entirely.
Like driving and having a conversation.
Right. And you rely much more on your own internal or intrinsic feedback at this point.
That makes a lot of sense. And the engine that really powers this progression, especially getting from that conscious effort to automaticity, is often called deliberate practice. Is that right?
Yes, that's a key concept. It's purposeful, focused practice, specifically designed to push you just beyond your current comfort zone. It often involves targeted repetition and, importantly, analysis of what you're doing.
Gotcha. The notes also give us some lenses for assessing progress, especially maybe in physical skills: acquisition, retention, and transfer.
Right. Those are important distinctions. Acquisition is basically your performance during the practice itself. How well are you doing it right now?
Okay.
Retention is how well you can perform the skill after a break.
Mhm.
Can you still do it tomorrow or next week? Does it stick?
And transfer.
Critically, transfer is your ability to apply that skill in new or slightly different situations. Can you adapt it?
So the real goal isn't just doing it, well, now it's acquisition, but being able to do it later, retention, and use it creatively, transfer.
Exactly. That's where the real value lies.
And this connects back to how you use feedback as you move through those stages: cognitive, associative, autonomous.
Precisely. Early on in that cognitive stage, you might need quite detailed external guidance, extrinsic feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Later in the autonomous stage, you need to be able to feel your own mistakes and adjust using that intrinsic feedback. The strategy has to adapt as you learn.
Okay, let's really dig into how you practice, because the notes make it crystal clear that just putting in hours isn't enough. The structure of your practice profoundly impacts that long-term retention and transfer.
Absolutely. This is crucial. One key aspect is the timing. Massed versus distributed practice.
Mass sounds like cramming, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
right before a test.
That's the feeling, yeah. It's practice with very little rest between trials or sessions, just going at it relentlessly.
And does it work?
Well, it can lead to faster initial gains. You might feel like you're improving quickly in that single session, but the notes warn about fatigue setting in, motivation dropping,
Yeah.
and most importantly, significantly poorer long-term retention and transfer. What you learned just doesn't stick as well.
Okay, so the alternative is distributed practice.
Yeah.
Spreading it out.
Yes, spreading it out over time with more breaks between sessions or trials. This often feels slower initially. You might not see that dramatic improvement in one session, but the notes strongly show it leads to superior long-term retention and much better transfer to new situations. It builds more robust skill.
Okay, so why does taking breaks and spacing it out work so much better for keeping the skill and using it later? That feels a little counterintuitive sometimes.
It does, doesn't it? But this is one of those great desirable difficulty principles the notes mention. One key reason is what's called the forgetting hypothesis.
Forgetting, that sounds bad.
Well, maybe not. When you space out practice, you naturally forget bits of what you did last time, just a little.
Okay.
When you come back to it, your brain is forced to work harder to retrieve and reconstruct the memory or the movement plan.
Ah, the effort of remembering.
Exactly. This active process of retrieval and reconstruction actually strengthens the memory trace much more than just mindlessly repeating it without a break.
Wow, so forgetting isn't just a failure of memory, it's actually an active catalyst for strengthening what you learn, because you have to work to get it back.
That's the surprising but powerful insight. Another factor is the consolidation hypothesis, basically. Breaks give your brain time to process and solidify the learning that just happened.
Like saving a file.
Kind of like saving a file, yeah.
Yeah.
Spacing gives the brain time to save the new information effectively, integrate it.
So for long-term mastery, distributed practice is generally the way to go, even if massed feels faster in the moment.
Generally, yes. Especially for complex skills. Massed might have a very small place for super simple, discrete tasks or just getting a quick initial feel for something, but the long-term evidence heavily favors distributed practice.
Okay, timing matters. Got it.
Right.
What about mixing up what you practice? The notes talk about blocked versus random practice.
Right. Blocked practice means you repeat the same specific skill or movement over and over again before moving on to a different one.
Like doing 50 free throws, then 50 layups, then 50 jump shots.
Exactly. This feels pretty easy during practice. There's low contextual interference. You get into a groove.
Okay, and random practice is mixing them all up. Free throw, layup, jump shot, free throw.
Precisely. You interleave different skills or variations unpredictably. This creates high contextual interference. Now, the Nates highlight a really significant finding here.
Which is?
High contextual interference random practice usually leads to poorer performance during the practice session itself. You'll likely make more mistakes, feel more frustrated. It feels harder.
But there's always a but with these, isn't there?
There often is, but it results in dramatically superior long-term retention and enhanced transfer of skills later on. Blocked practice feels smooth during the session, but leads to poorer retention and transfer. It's less durable.
Okay, this is another one that feels backward. Why does struggling more during practice lead to better results down the road?
It's that desirable difficulty concept again.
Yeah.
The notes point to a couple of mechanisms, actually quite similar to distributed practice. One is that forgetting reconstruction hypothesis we just talked about.
How does that apply here?
When you switch between different skills in random practice, you essentially have to abandon the motor plan for the previous skill. When you inevitably return to it later in the session, you're forced to actively reconstruct that plan from memory.
Ah, you can't just keep it loaded.
Right. This repeated reconstruction strengthens the underlying representation of the skill.
Got it. Like having to find the right mental file folder each time instead of just leaving it open on the desk.
That's a good way to put it. Another idea is the elaboration distinctiveness view. Random practice kind of forces you to compare and contrast the different movements or skills you're doing.
Okay.
This helps make their memory representations more unique, more distinct from each other, and easier to retrieve accurately later.
So random practice, like distributed practice, makes your brain work harder in ways that build a stronger, more adaptable skill, even if it feels less productive while you're doing it.
Precisely. And linked very closely to this is the principle of practice variability.
That's practicing under different conditions, like using different tools, different speeds, different environments, maybe even when you're a bit tired.
Yes, exactly. Varying the conditions during practice is essential for developing adaptable skills that can actually transfer to the real world, which is rarely predictable.
Right.
It helps you build more flexible mental blueprints. For action psychologists, sometimes call these generalized motor programs or schemas that you can tweak on the fly depending on the situation.
Whereas constant practice, always doing it the exact same way.
Leads to skills that are rigid and hard to apply outside that very specific practice context, less adaptable.
So if I want to learn to play guitar, I shouldn't just play the same song perfectly the same way every single time.
Ideally, no.
I should try playing it at different tempos, maybe with a capo, standing up versus sitting down, maybe even with a slightly different guitar if I can.
Exactly. Or if you're learning, say, a customer service script, practice it with different types of customer personalities simulated under time pressure or dealing with unexpected questions. The notes really stress that this variability is key for real-world transfer.
Okay, pulling the practice structure together then. It sounds like maybe you start with a tiny bit of blocked or masked practice just to get the very, very first feel for a brand new movement.
Possibly for the absolute basics.
But then you should quickly transition to distributed, random, and variable practice as the core strategy if you want robust, lasting skill.
That's the clear implication from the research highlighted in these notes, yes. And the big unifying idea is intentionally building these desirable difficulties into your practice.
Right.
Challenges like spacing out trials distributed, mixing up skills random, or changing conditions variable might make practice feel harder in the moment, but they force deeper cognitive processing.
Including that forgetting and reconstruction.
Absolutely. For much better long-term learning and flexibility.
And we shouldn't be afraid of that feeling of forgetting or maybe struggling a bit during random or distributed practice. It's actually a sign it's working.
It's often a sign that active, effortful processing is happening, which is exactly what you want for durable learning. One final point the notes touch on here is that these practice structures interact with your working memory capacity.
Meaning,
High contextual interference from random practice or very massed practice with little rest can be overwhelming, especially for complete novices or maybe individuals with lower working memory capacity.
so you can overdo the difficulty.
You can. You need to calibrate the difficulty level. Don't make it impossibly hard, just desirably difficult. Find that sweet spot.
Okay, so you structured your practice well. But once you're practicing, how do you know if you're even doing it right? That brings us to feedback.
Essential. Absolutely essential. Feedback is basically information you get about your movements or the outcomes of those movements. And the notes highlight 3 core functions. It guides you towards the correct technique or outcome. It motivates you to keep trying, and it reinforces successful actions, making them more likely to happen again.
Makes sense. What are the different kinds of feedback?
Well, you have intrinsic feedback. That's the sensory information coming from your own body. What the movement feels like, that's proprioception. What you see happening, what you hear, what you feel from the environment as you act.
The body's own signals.
Exactly. And developing sensitivity to this is crucial for eventually self-correcting.
And then there's extrinsic, or sometimes called augmented feedback.
Right. That comes from an external source, a coach telling you something, watching a video replay of yourself, seeing data from a sensor or a device.
Okay.
It supplements your intrinsic feedback, providing information you might not be able to get on your own. This is especially important for beginners who can't yet interpret their intrinsic cues accurately.
And within extrinsic, the notes mention KR and KP, knowledge of results and knowledge of performance.
Yes. Knowledge of results, KR, tells you about the outcome of your action. You hit the bullseye, your shot missed left, you finish the task in 30 seconds. It's about the goal.
Got it.
Knowledge of performance, KP, on the other hand, tells you about the quality of the movement itself. Your elbow angle was off, your grip was too tight, your follow-through was weak. This is key for refining the technique, the form.
Which one is better?
It depends. KR is often good for understanding the task goal, especially in early stages. KP is usually more helpful for refining the movement pattern, especially later. The notes also suggest that prescriptive KP telling you how to fix something is often more helpful than just descriptive KP just stating what happened.
Right, actionable advice. Timing and frequency must matter too, I assume. When should you get it and how often?
Absolutely. You can get concurrent feedback, which is given during the action.
Like a coach yelling instructions while you swing.
Kind of, yeah. Or terminal feedback, which comes after the action is completed. Immediate feedback, right after you finish, can be great early on for fixing big, obvious errors quickly. But the notes warn about a potential trap here: dependency.
Dependency, like you become reliant on someone constantly telling you what to do or what went wrong instead of learning to feel it yourself.
Exactly that. This is known as the guidance hypothesis. Too much external feedback given too frequently or too immediately can actually prevent you from developing your own internal error detection and correction systems. You stop listening to your own body.
Okay, so how do you avoid that trap? Less feedback, different timing.
Both can play a role. Delayed feedback given after a short interval can be surprisingly powerful. That delay gives you a moment to process your own intrinsic feedback first.
You try to figure it out yourself.
Yes, you try to evaluate your own performance before getting the external information. It forces deeper processing and helps you learn to rely more on yourself, less on the coach or the device.
So, similar to distributed practice, a short delay in feedback can actually enhance learning by forcing that self-reliance and deeper processing. Another desirable difficulty.
Precisely. It fits that pattern. Frequency is also key. High-frequency feedback, maybe after every single attempt, might be useful right at the beginning for getting the gross movements right. But as you improve...
You back off.
Exactly. The notes strongly recommend reducing or fading the frequency of feedback as skill improves.
To encourage that self-evaluation again, break the dependency.
Yes. And there are specific schedules designed for this, like summary feedback, where you get feedback for a whole block of trials at once, not after each one, or bandwidth feedback.
Bandwidth feedback, how does that work?
It's particularly clever for promoting autonomy. You set an acceptable range of error, a bandwidth. You only get feedback if your performance falls outside that range.
If I make a small mistake, but it's still kind of within the good enough zone, I get nothing.
Right, silence. This pushes you to self-correct those minor deviations without waiting for external confirmation. It prevents dependency and really fosters autonomy.
That makes a lot of sense. So the ultimate goal of feedback isn't just to fix mistakes now, it's to cultivate your ability to monitor and correct yourself. So eventually you need that external feedback less and less. You become your own coach.
Beautifully put. That's exactly it. Make external feedback eventually redundant by building internal capabilities.
Got it. Okay, practice structure guides how you learn, feedback guides what to refine. What about the internal drive, motivation, and goal setting? That's got to be huge.
These are absolutely the fuel and the map for the entire journey. Motivation is the engine driving effort and persistence. Without it, practice feels like a chore.
And we often hear about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. How do the notes frame these?
Intrinsic motivation comes from within the sheer enjoyment of the process itself. Curiosity, the satisfaction of mastery, maybe a sense of purpose. The notes strongly link this to deeper engagement, greater persistence when things get tough, and better long-term outcomes, including academic achievement.
And how do you nurture that?
It's often nurtured by feeling a sense of competence, like you're getting better, feeling connection, maybe learning with others, or having a supportive teacher, and feeling control or autonomy over your learning.
Okay, and extrinsic is the outside stuff: grades, praise, money, avoiding punishment, stickers.
Yeah, the
That's
external rewards or consequences, these can be useful strategically, especially for getting started on something difficult or recognizing significant milestones. But
There's a but again.
there is. The notes caution that over-relying on extrinsic motivators can lead to dependency, a focus only on the reward rather than the learning, and potentially burnout if the reward is removed or feels controlling.
The notes mention frameworks like self-determination theory, or SDT. What's the core idea there?
A key concept in SDT is that humans have these fundamental psychological needs that drive growth and well-being. The need for autonomy, feeling like you have choice and control, competence, feeling effective and capable, and relatedness, feeling connected to others.
Okay.
When your learning environment meets these needs, intrinsic motivation tends to flourish naturally.
Makes sense. And achievement motivation, setting different kinds of goals.
Right. Another angle is achieving goal theory. This contrasts different orientations towards achievement. You have mastery goals.
Focused on learning.
Exactly, focused on learning, understanding, self-improvement. The goal is, I want to really get better at this skill. Then you have performance goals.
Focused on comparison.
Often, yes, focused on outperforming others, demonstrating competence relative to others, or avoiding looking incompetent. I want to get the best grade, or I just don't want to look stupid doing this.
And mastery goals are generally better for learning.
The research suggests mastery goals are generally associated with more resilient motivation, seeking challenges, and using deeper learning strategies. Performance goals can sometimes lead to anxiety or avoiding challenges where failure is possible.
And expectancy theory, that sounds like you have to believe you can actually do it and that the outcome is worth the effort.
Exactly. It basically boils down to three beliefs. Expectancy, if I put in effort, will I actually be able to perform well? Instrumentality, if I perform well, will it actually lead to a desired outcome? And valence, how much do I actually value that outcome?
And if any one of those is low.
Motivation suffers. All three need to be reasonably high for strong motivation. You need to believe the effort is worth it and will likely pay off.
Okay, and goal setting brings structure to this whole motivational landscape. Like, it makes these theories practical.
Fundamentally, yes. Effective goals provide focus, they direct your effort, and crucially, they give you a way to track your progress, which feeds back into that feeling of competence.
The notes mention SMART goals, right?
Yeah.
Specific, measurable.
Attainable, relevant, time-bound. Yes, the SMART framework is a well-known tool for structuring effective goals. It makes them concrete.
And the notes also emphasize proximal versus distal goals, short-term versus long-term.
Right, proximal goals are your short-term milestones, the steps along the way. Distal goals are the long-term aspirations, the big picture. The notes suggest proximal goals are often particularly powerful for sustaining motivation and persistence day to day.
Why is that? Because you get those frequent little wins and feel like you're actually making progress more often.
Yes, exactly that. They provide regular feedback and reinforcement. They break down a potentially daunting distal goal into much more manageable chunks. Ideally, you combine both. Proximal goals build the path towards the distal vision.
And setting goals like this is a core part of becoming a self-regulated learner, someone who manages their own learning.
Absolutely. It's central to taking ownership. Setting your own direction with goals, choosing strategies to reach them, monitoring how you're doing, reflecting on the process that's self-regulation in action. Goals are the compass and the map you create for yourself.
It sounds like connecting the learning to your own values is critical too. The relevant and SMART goals, or the usefulness idea mentioned in some motivation models. If you don't see why it matters to you personally, the fuel just won't be there.
Precisely. Making that personal connection, seeing the value or relevance for your own life or interests is absolutely vital for tapping into that deep, sustainable, intrinsic drive.
Okay, practice, feedback, motivation.
Oh, crucial.
But what about the person actually doing the learning? Individual differences must play a huge role.
A massive piece of the puzzle. No two learners are exactly alike, and these differences profoundly shape the skill development journey. Age and developmental stage are obvious factors. Learning is lifelong, but how we learn changes over time.
Like Piaget's stages, you can't really teach abstract calculus to a toddler because their brain isn't ready for that kind of thinking yet.
Right. The reference to developmental stages like Piaget's is a good reminder of readiness. Matching the complexity and the type of learning task to the learner's current cognitive capacity is key. Trying to force abstract concepts before the brain has developed the necessary structures isn't effective.
And age differences continue throughout adulthood. It's not just kids.
Oh, definitely. The notes discuss that older adults, for instance, might use different learning strategies, perhaps take longer to acquire complex sequences, or show some changes in motor speed or precision.
Okay.
There might even be sensitive periods where acquiring certain types of implicit skills, things you learn without conscious awareness, is easier earlier in life, maybe before adolescence for some skills.
But it's not all downhill after 20.
Not at all. It's not simple decline. Some abilities are remarkably well preserved, and crucially, prior knowledge and accumulated experience can often compensate effectively for some age-related changes in processing speed or working memory.
That prior experience and knowledge must be a massive factor then, regardless of age.
It's absolutely foundational. Your existing knowledge acts like a mental framework, a scaffold, making it easier to integrate new information and skills. Cognitive load theory highlights this well.
How so?
Prior knowledge, when it's well organized into mental structures called schemas, significantly reduces the strain on your working memory when you're learning something new in that area. You're not starting from scratch.
So experts aren't just faster because they practice more. Their
Mhm.
brains handle the relevant information much more efficiently because of that built-in structure they've developed over time.
Exactly. It's about having that integrated knowledge base and efficient strategies. And this comes from experience plus deliberate engagement with challenging problems, not just putting in the hours.
Right.
And that prior experience is also crucial for transfer of learning, being able to apply skills and knowledge effectively in new situations.
What about inherent abilities? Are some people just naturally better at certain things, like coordination or memory?
The notes touch on this, distinguishing between inherent and developed abilities, but they really emphasize that many abilities we might think of as fixed are actually quite malleable. They can be improved.
Like what?
Cognitive abilities like working memory capacity, your ability to focus attention, processing speed, reasoning skills, these are all important, especially for the cognitive stages of learning and for turning explicit knowledge into smooth procedural actions.
Okay.
And perceptual abilities too, like having a good eye or quick reaction times. This includes skills like detecting subtle stimuli, recognizing patterns quickly, anticipating events based on cues.
Do you train those?
Yes,
Yeah.
perceptual learning is a real thing. You can improve your sensory acuity and pattern recognition with the right kind of practice. The notes mention fascinating examples like the quiet eye phenomenon in elite athletes.
What's
It's a specific pattern of visual attention, a longer, steadier gaze fixed on a critical location just before initiating a movement, like a basketball player looking at the hoop before a free throw. It's a highly developed perceptual cognitive skill linked to expertise and success.
wow. And motor abilities, obviously strength, coordination, balance.
Of course, those directly impact physical skills, but again, motor learning itself is about refining movements through practice, guided by instructions, feedback, motivation, all the things we've discussed. Physical competence matters, but it also develops.
So the key takeaway here isn't that you're just limited by what you're born with, but that many of these underlying capacities, cognitive, perceptual, motor, can actually be developed and improved through targeted training and practice.
Absolutely, that's a crucial message. Cognitive training exists, perceptual learning exercises work, targeted physical conditioning builds motor abilities. Abilities are dynamic, not fixed statues.
Good to know.
And age brings changes, yes, but prior knowledge and adaptability play a huge role. And remembering developmental readiness, like from Piaget, helps ensure you're teaching or learning effectively at any age by matching the task to the capability.
Okay, last major factor. The backdrop for all this learning. The environment. This has to matter.
Profoundly. The notes are very clear. The environment isn't just a passive container, it actively facilitates or hinders skill development in multiple ways. That includes the physical environment, first off.
Like just having a quiet place to study, or having the right equipment for a physical skill, like a good tennis court or a functioning lab.
Precisely. The layout of a space, the quality of facilities and equipment, things like lighting, noise levels, safety, even your home environment, all significantly impact your ability to focus, to explore, to practice effectively. A well-designed physical space can reduce anxiety and genuinely support learning.
And the social environment seems equally, if not more, important.
Hugely so. This is about your interactions with peers, instructors, mentors, the overall group climate or culture.
Like whether it's collaborative or competitive.
Exactly. The notes highlight cooperative learning where people work together towards interdependent goals as being particularly powerful. It doesn't just help with the task. It fosters teamwork, communication, negotiation skills, even critical thinking and conflict resolution.
And just having supportive people around you must make a difference.
Absolutely critical. Encouraging coaches, instructors, mentors, supportive peers, they provide vital psychological safety and support for social and emotional growth, which in turn underpins academic and skill learning. Positive peer relationships are foundational for developing social competence.
Resource availability is another obvious environmental factor. Money, tech, time.
Yes. Access to financial support, appropriate technology, well-trained instructors, quality materials, sufficient time to practice, access to good information, and maybe even experts. Shortages in any of these areas can significantly impede progress.
You can't learn coding easily without a computer, for example.
A clear example. And conversely, access to good information resources empowers self-directed learning.
And socioeconomic status, SES, often impacts that resource access, doesn't it?
Yes, the notes point to SES as a major background factor. It often influences the quality of both home and school environments, access to enriching opportunities and resources.
Mhm.
And it can impact foundational skills like literacy and numeracy right from an early age, potentially creating compounding advantages for some and disadvantages for others throughout their educational journey.
And the last piece? Cultural factors. How does culture play into skill development?
This is about the shared values, beliefs, and norms of a community, an organization, or society. These shape how learning itself is perceived and approached.
In what way?
Culture influences what skills are considered valuable, how knowledge is expected to be transmitted, in, for example, lecture versus active learning, preferred communication styles, the nature of student-teacher relationships, levels of parental involvement, whether individualism or collectivism is emphasized.
So maybe whether group work or individual study feels more natural or is more encouraged.
Exactly. It can influence preferred learning styles, passive versus active, group versus individual. Cultural context also deeply influences how feedback is given and received and how success or failure is interpreted.
So culture is like the invisible water you swim in. It shapes almost everything about how you approach and experience learning within that context.
That's a great way to put it. And the physical and social environments are deeply intertwined. Together, they create the overall learning climate. A thoughtful physical space can actively encourage positive social interaction, for instance.
And SES, as you mentioned, is like a meta-constraint.
Yes, the notes use that term because it often influences multiple environmental factors simultaneously: resources, physical space quality, access to support networks, and sometimes even the prevailing social or cultural norms experienced in different communities or schools.
And the cultural context doesn't just affect methods. It shapes the very meaning you attach to effort, feedback, and achievement. So optimal learning isn't some universal formula. It needs cultural sensitivity and adaptation.
Absolutely. What works well in one cultural context might need significant adaptation in another. And remember, resources aren't just physical things. They critically include human resources, skilled, dedicated teachers, supportive mentors, engaged peers. A lack of that human support can be just as limiting, maybe even more so, than a lack of books or computers.
Wow. Okay, so bringing this all together, we've got practice structure, feedback mechanisms, motivation and goals, individual learner differences, and the whole environmental context. The notes really emphasize that skill development is truly holistic, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It emerges from this incredibly complex interplay of all these factors: cognitive, emotional, social processes, all happening within specific physical, social, and cultural contexts. You can't really isolate one piece.
And progress or challenges in one area inevitably affect others.
Definitely. Think about it. Difficulty with fine motor skills impact handwriting, which might affect motivation in school. Social anxiety might hinder participation in group learning. It's all connected. That's why holistic education considers the whole learner and the interconnectedness of different kinds of skills: academic, creative, critical thinking, social, emotional.
So if we want to help ourselves or others learn effectively, we need a strategy. Are there evidence-based principles to guide how we design learning experiences?
Yes, thankfully. The notes synthesize several, things like decomposing complex skills into smaller, manageable parts, providing systematic instruction, clear guidance, and reinforcement, ensuring ample and appropriately structured practice.
Remembering those desirable difficulties.
Exactly. The amount and the type of practice matter hugely for long-term results. Using approaches like problem-based learning to encourage active application and integration of knowledge, and constantly monitoring progress with data to see what's working and adjust the approach as needed.
And frameworks like the ones mentioned in the notes, Gagne's events or the UMusic model, help tie these principles together in a practical way.
They do. They provide structured ways to think about designing instruction. For example, Gagne's 9 events incorporate gaining attention, informing learners of objectives, stimulating recall of prior learning, presenting content, providing guidance, eliciting performance practice, providing feedback, assessing performance, and enhancing retention and transfer. It hits many of the factors we've discussed.
Right, it integrates them.
And models like music focus specifically on motivation, ensuring learners feel empowered, see the usefulness, believe they can succeed, are interested, and feel cared for by the instructor. Addressing those beliefs and environmental elements directly impacts drive.
And the interplay is dynamic, changing one thing affects others.
Yes, it requires systems thinking. If you change the practice structure to be more random, it might increase cognitive load initially, potentially affecting motivation if it feels too hard. You have to consider the whole system.
And ultimately, the notes seem to point towards fostering self-regulated learners as the ideal outcome, empowering the individual,
That really does seem to be the gold standard. We want to help individuals become people who can take ownership of their own learning journey.
meaning they.
They set their own meaningful goals. They consciously select appropriate learning strategies. They monitor their own progress effectively. They know when and how to seek help, and they reflect on what works and what doesn't for them.
And things like fading feedback, cultivating intrinsic motivation, teaching goal-setting skills, encouraging metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, all contribute to that.
Precisely. All these strategies work together to empower the learner to become their own guide, their own self-sensei, if you will.
So we've taken quite a deep dive into these notes from Self-Sensei, and it's just crystal clear that becoming skilled at anything is anything but a simple one-step process. It's not like flicking a switch.
Not at all. It's this rich, dynamic, often fascinating interplay of how you challenge yourself in practice, the quality and timing of the guidance and feedback you receive, the internal drive that fuels your effort and persistence.
The unique blueprint you bring as an individual learner, your age, experience, abilities.
And the supportive or sometimes challenging world around you, your physical, social, and cultural environment. All of it matters.
Understanding these factors isn't just academic, it feels incredibly practical. It means we can potentially move beyond generic one-size-fits-all approaches to training or teaching.
Exactly. We can really start to tailor how we teach, how we coach, or even how we structure our own personal learning projects to unlock potential much more effectively, acknowledging all this complexity.
And this really isn't just about reaching a certain skill level and stopping. It's about embracing that continuous journey of learning, adapting, and refining throughout our entire lives.
Well said. It's a lifelong process.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture one last time, consider again that really fascinating idea we discussed, that forgetting, which we usually see as a failure, can actually be a vital catalyst for strengthening memory and skill precisely because it forces reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. That desirable difficulty.
Right. So this raises an important question for you, the listener.
Hmm.
How could you intentionally build short periods of forgetting or maybe some kind of interference into your own learning process, or maybe into how you teach or guide someone else, specifically to make that learning stick better in the long run? What stands out most to you from this deep dive?